Thank you.
We'll get done. The show will be finished by the time we've all been introduced. But as you can tell, and good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for coming. As you can tell, we have a panel of stars over here. And by that, I don't mean celebrities. I mean journalists that I respect and really, really look up to. And by your numbers, I can tell that a lot of you are here to listen to their stories. Every year, at JLF, we have a session. This is a fixture. We have a session on the front lines where we try to bring you the front line by bringing you journalists who will tell you their stories. But I'll be honest, I do moderate the show quite often, and my heart has grown heavier every year because I have the stories of journalist after journalist coming here telling me how they're dealing with the fallout, and particularly the idea that none of these wars that we live in are going away. We're living with these conflicts forever. Conflicts that don't end. Sometimes they wither away because nobody's paying any attention. But they continue to leave that fallout piercing the hearts of all those who live there and all those who have actually gone to cover those stories. Just in this decade, and we're in 2025, halfway through the third decade of this century. Just look at what we as a society, global society, have been through. The Russia-Ukraine war, October 7th, the bombardment, destruction of Gaza, the broader Middle East conflict, elections, which have been a trauma of their own, and there is a whole session on that today. The rise of alpha leaders, who are changing the way we look at the world and the rules that govern the world. COVID, climate change, trade disruptions, I can just keep going on and on and on. I want to start by asking each of our panelists a simple question. So I'm going to go around each of you, and if you could give me the simplest answer to the question. We know the stories you have reported that changed the world. But what is the story that changed you? Lindsey, can I come to you first?
Thank you. The story that changed me was Rwanda. I happened to be living in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, in 1994 when the genocide started. And it's a very different thing to do what most of us do, which is to go into a conflict and find out what's happening, and to be living somewhere and a conflict erupts around you. It's much more frightening. It's much more personal. And because I was living there, friends, people I knew were ringing me and asking me to save them, and I couldn't save them. And I saw things in that conflict which I'm not going to talk about today because they're the worst things I've ever seen. And that is what made me feel that not just that human beings are not perfectible, but it was very hard after that. It took me a long time to come back to understand the good in people, because there is a lot of good in people. And you see a lot of that in war. You see the best, but you also see the worst. And in Rwanda, I felt I saw the worst.
Lindsey's book actually begins, the book is called I Brought the War With Me, and it begins with a poem by Warsan Shah. I've pronounced it correctly, I hope. Who's a British poet, but I think from Nigeria?
She's Somali-Kenyan origin.
And it says, the poem begins with, I brought the war with me unknowingly, perhaps on my skin, plumes of it in my hair, under my nails. You know, that's how every journalist really feels. They bring the war home with them. I want to come to you, Yaroslav. Your book really looks, the previous book, there's a new one out, No Country for Love, but your previous book looks at how you went through the first days of the invasion of Ukraine. What is the story that changed you? Is that the one?
Well, actually, no. For me, what changed the way I look at the world was the invasion of Iraq. And, I was born and grew up in Ukraine. Like many people in Eastern Europe, we looked up to America as a power that would liberate it, that did help liberate us from oppression and communism. You know, Ronald Reagan was a hero in my childhood among people who I was growing up with. And having lived in the US after that, and driving into Iraq in 2003, and then spending that first 2 years in Iraq watching the occupation and how brutal and unthinking and just dumb so many things were, it really made me think. And one of the thoughts I remember catching myself having in Fallujah in 2000, I'd say 4, maybe 5, watching a young American soldier play with the laser on bypassers, like laser from his sniper rifle, just unthinkingly, just to freak people out, was like, I'm really happy Ukraine was never occupied by the US, or anyone else for that matter. And so I think this whole idea that all occupations are bad, no matter how well-intentioned, was that moment.
And I can tell you, as someone who's covered some of these countries abroad, every time I'd go, especially in our own neighborhood, and go around going, this could never happen to us, thank God. And then it does. It's one of those things, and of course we have a session tomorrow where we'll talk a little bit more on those issues. Vishnu, there's a photograph in one of the stories you've done out of Ukraine that has this giant teddy bear with a carcass of a cat next to it, and it's there in this middle of the rubble. I want to ask you, what is the story that changed you? But I want you to tell me a little bit about that teddy bear as well.
It's an interesting story because after doing this story, I've often wondered whether I was potentially misled. But in hindsight, I believe the story was accurate. And I'll tell you why I was potentially misled. But the story itself is from a town called Borodyanka, which lies about 2.5 hours away from Kiev to the north. And this was a town where, a small city, I would say, which had been devastated during the war. The Russians had absolutely plundered it. They'd used rape as a weapon. Parts of the city, the town were completely destroyed. And all of a sudden, while I was driving through Borodyanka, there was this apartment building block. One entire block was destroyed. And right in the middle of that, there was a teddy bear, a large teddy bear. The teddy bear didn't have eyes. There were other stuffed animals close by. I immediately asked my driver to stop the car because I felt that this was rather poignant and it's something that's worth reporting. So I went up over there. I saw the carcass of a kitten. Ukrainians love their kittens, their cats. They just do. They love their pets. And I noticed the child's umbrella as well. And for me, the story over there was that this was probably the room of a child. And that child may or may not have survived that. But that all that remained of this entire apartment block, which was destroyed, was this rather large teddy bear with no eyes and a small umbrella, a carcass of a kitten, and I think a broken cell phone as well. The reason I began by saying, Suhasini, that was this disinformation was because that's something when you cover conflict, you need to. This was too perfect. It was too perfect. Did somebody set it up for an alert journalist to potentially... So I went back to Borodyanka and I asked, and I don't speak Ukrainian, and I had translators, very good ones. But they all said that, no, that's been lying there for some days. And so I stand by the story.
Absolutely. And of course, there are many other stories you have over covering wars. You told me about running behind chickens to catch them because otherwise there would be no dinner for the journalists covering a certain war. Christopher, sometimes for journalists, what Vishnu's talking about is we see the blood and the gore. We sometimes, unfortunately, have to see things others don't, as Lindsey spoke about. But I always feel like when we're actually covering those stories and getting those photographs or video, we see it kind of in black and white, a little distant from it. Now, you told me you've never worn a flak jacket, and yet you've covered all kinds of distress of the lasting impacts of conflict. What is the story that changed you?
No one should read into that I'm foolhardy and brave. I've never worn a flak jacket because I've never been in a war. I've always been the guy who's 10 miles behind the front line and is nervously listening to the bombardment, and when it dies down, then I sort of gingerly head forward. I would like to just mention, because we are all on stage here, yesterday tribute was paid to the journalists in Gaza who provided so much information to the outside world, many of whom their names will not register with many of the Western listeners and viewers. I would also like to mention here the fixes that we have all used as journalists. And these fixes when you go into a war zone or you go into a situation of extreme precariousness, you develop a very quick and extremely urgent bond with your fixer. And that fixer doesn't want to be your fixer because they already have jobs. They're teachers or they're engineers. They're only there because, in my case, my country and countries my country was allied with invaded them. It's a very, very difficult position to be in. And that bond that is created is an extremely ambiguous and in some ways a very beautiful one. I'm not a war reporter. I approach war from an oblique angle. So that means when I do go in 10 days after, or a few days after the artillery dies down, I'm looking for things from a different angle. And in Iraq, that was culture. I was interested in what Iraq meant to Iraqis, so I looked at the Iraq National Museum and how it had been looted, and I tried to discover what had actually happened, because the Americans said it was just the Iraqis. They're congenital looters. And of course, that wasn't true. In Herat in Afghanistan, it was 7 minarets that stood from the time of Herat's extraordinary cultural fluorescence in the 16th century. And that was my way into a story that was about culture and it was about identity. But perhaps the strangest story that I've done from, and perhaps the unlikeliest bit of war reporting I did, was from 2010 when I went to Afghanistan, and instead of embedding with the US Army or the British Army and finding out about what was happening in their war with the Taliban, I did a parallel war. And I went and spent 2 weeks in the company of cockfighters. And I went around the country from meet to meet, and I followed one particular cockfighter and his rooster until that rooster was killed. And the insights that one gains by looking at war, but from one step to the side, can be very interesting and very poignant. So I think we're all interested in war because, as you say, it brings out the best and it brings out the worst. And we're all interested in the extremities of the human condition. And that's certainly true of me.
Perfect. Ghaith, you've also lived your own war in your own country. And then you've covered Syria and Yemen and looked at almost like Groundhog Day, you know, how the invasion begins and how it ends and how that forever war continues. What is the one story that changed you?
I mean, I have to say I am an accidental journalist. I didn't choose to become a journalist. It's the Americans made me a journalist because they invaded my country.
Americans are getting a lot of press on this particular panel.
And I have to say, I was so lucky to start journalism working with Ed as his translator back in the days in Baghdad.
I was lucky to learn from you.
But so it is very strange, and I'm sure we'll talk about this tomorrow, is when the war comes into your own country. So I was an architect, I loved my job, and then suddenly, you know, you have tanks in the streets, you have the presidential palace, the dictator that ruled your life, all your life, is toppled, and you can't become a civilian after that. You can't become an architect after that. So that was my introduction to conflict, is when your own city, when your own street, the places where you grew up, you played, you went to school, becomes a frontline, battlefields, and how do you negotiate that? But I have to say, it's a decade later, or more than a decade, in Mosul, in the streets of Mosul, where I saw the real meaning of war, in which a person that you can play chess with at night, someone who takes care of you, a fighter, would next day commit a crime and kill people. So how do you negotiate that feeling? Is he a criminal? Yes. Is he a person? Yes. How do you write about that without... So.
And so many have been through that your protector is actually not a good person, or how we would see it. Nobody knows that better than you, Edward. And what you've written in your book about being the child of two empires, China and the US, both, it would seem, not winning the popularity stakes right now. What is the story that has changed it all for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you say. The thing that made me form an idea about empires today was first going to report on the Iraq War, where I worked with Ghaith at the start of the war, and I was there for 3.5 years. And then I moved to China and worked there for nearly 9 years. And at the end of that time, I decided I needed to write a book about China. And I interviewed my father about his past in China. And what I discovered was that he had been part of the People's Liberation Army of China under Mao. And he had taken part in the military occupation of northwestern China, or Xinjiang, where the Uyghur Muslims and the Kazakh Muslims live. And I reflected on what he told me about his zeal for the Communist Revolution and why he signed up for the military. First, to fight against Americans in Korea, that was his first idea. And then to engage, with eagerness in helping the military as it occupied this region, this largely Muslim region in the Northwest. And I realized there was a parallel between what he was telling me and what I was learning from him and what I saw in Iraq with the American soldiers, the young American soldiers there, that there is in these two powers, there is a sense of exceptionalism that the citizens have and that the people who rule these countries have, that they believe that they are sort of almost blessed by some divine right to give something to the rest of the world. And sometimes that's done by influence, and sometimes that's done by force. And that idea justifies whatever they do elsewhere in the world. It justified what my father did out in northwest China. It justified for the Americans what they did in Iraq, even though we know about the disastrous consequences of these military occupations.
Could I ask you, sorry, do you want to?
And obviously Russia also has the same idea of exceptionalism.
There are such similarities actually between all of these. One of those similarities is the times we live in now as we report. The idea that, of course, we used to look at China, at the strict controls. I've done stories from Xinjiang. The idea was, don't cover them while you're there. You can go home and write those stories. But how do you think it works for those who live there, for whom the politics that they cover is also personal, it's also the future of their countries? We see the kind of polarization in the United States today, where journalists are actively attacked for taking a position that is not popular. Do you think that it's become more and more difficult to cover our own stories? It's easy to go to somebody else's war and say, here are these guys and here are these guys and they're fighting with each other and this is the atrocity of the government. But it's different when you're covering your own, is it? Edward, I'll come to Ghaith in a bit.
All right, it's a very pertinent question, because even like this morning, I was getting messages from sources in Washington talking about the dismantling of the federal government by the Trump administration. So right now in the US, we're actively covering these massive changes to the US under even the first week of this type of governance that I think we had expected, but are still, somewhat taken aback by the speed with which it's happening. And so it does feel very personal, covering this move towards a different style of government. Some people might say authoritarian, others might use a different word for it. But anyways, it's changing the US and it feels personal. But I also, going back, Iraq's the common theme that we've all talked about. And I think that I'm not that surprised by it, because the formative experience I had in looking at what my government is capable of doing was in Iraq. And so I'm not that surprised by what's going on now.
All right. In fact, I'm sure we'll be hearing much more from something. I've written a column today where I talk about the idea of Trumperica. So in the next few years, we might have conflicts where in Panama, in Canada, in Greenland, and all the rest that we might have to hear about. Ghaith, the question remains, what do you do when it's all personal? The story you write is not something that's going to be read 5,000 miles away, where there's no connection. These are stories that could put your family in danger. They could make it difficult for you to walk out.
I mean, there is a reason why I never write in Arabic, because English becomes a way to distance yourself from the story. So it kind of less personal in a way, but also how do you, the challenge is you're writing about your own people. There is this sense of right and wrong, right? So there is an occupation, and I'm against that occupation. But that doesn't make me instantly on the side of the people fighting the occupation. So you end up in a kind of a very awkward place. You have to almost become a foreigner in your own place. You speak the language, you can decode the symbols, but you need to detach yourself and not see it as, oh, those are my people because they look like me and they're, you know, shooting at this American tank and they're not like me. So that is the, and then of course, the occupation, the war with the occupation ends within a year or 2 years. What impacts the people in Baghdad or other cities is the sectarian war. And how do you distinguish? Because all Arabs look the same, and I can assure you Sunnis and Shia look the same. So how do you distinguish at a checkpoint who is this? And that is another kind of layer of the system.
And the lasting impact of that. Yaroslav, you have to be a citizen dealing with an invading power, but you also have to be a journalist. Sometimes the war doesn't go the way of your own country. How do you deal with this aspect of the personal being the story?
Yeah, so, you know, full-scale war came to Ukraine in 2022, though the actual war began in 2014. And I've ended up covering it after a lifetime of covering wars and conflicts in other people's countries. And it is very different. It feels very personal. And I remember standing in the main street of Kiev, where I grew up, where I have so many memories from my childhood, wearing a flak jacket, wearing a helmet. The street was empty. There were no cars, no people. There was a thud of artillery. I was thinking, this is profoundly wrong. How can it be? But I think this is, what people in Baghdad, in Kabul, and lots of other places in Beirut and in Gaza also were thinking. So it wasn't exceptional in the universal order of things. It was exceptional for me. What did it mean? I think I felt a sense of mission that went beyond what I did in other wars, and probably took more risks and pushed myself, because I felt that being from Ukraine, speaking languages, knowing at sort of visceral level what people say, what they mean when they say it, and how they behave, probably gave me sort of a little bit of extra ability to convey the story. And also, it is a kind of story that you could actually see the results of your reporting. I think in a way, because Ukraine was, given for dead. Everybody assumed that within 3 days it will be gone. And once you started writing about what's actually happening, once you start explaining and showing the situation, I think there was this tidal change in the public opinion in the world that actually ensured that Ukraine would get the support, would get the weapons that were denied it before that. And then I remember running into people in Ukraine, people from the US, Ireland, Italy, who said, we came to help because we, watched the news on TV, we read the articles. So it's one of those rare instances where you actually have this direct evidence of the fact that your work is meaningful.
Can I just add something?
Yes.
What's really annoying in Ukraine is the fact that Yarrow scoops the rest of us. Always. He's always 2 or 3 days ahead of everybody else. And that is very irritating.
We're all trying to put up a united front here.
Yeah, but I'm trying to be
back
realistic.
there, we're scrambling against, each other, trying to record our wins and not get scooped by the other. But Lindsey, there's a war that I think we have all personally lost, and that is in Afghanistan. When we look at the idea that, we covered 2001, and then we saw there were little institutions coming around. We met young women who were powerful, who were courageous. They were running institutions. They were running news organizations. They were doing, they were doing a little better than what we saw them in the first years of the 2000s. And today we just look at the daily list of degradation, of how women and young girls have new rules to wake up to every day. If in some countries you're seeing reforms bringing new freedoms for people, this is the opposite of that. What does it do for a journalist who thought, we covered the war, we covered what happened, but this is like, a forever war. It's never going to end for them. And I don't know, do we look away? What do we do?
Well, we are looking away, and that's the problem. And, it breaks my heart. I've spent some time in Afghanistan, as several others of us here, and have Afghan friends, female friends. One of my friends, Farzana Kochi, she was the youngest MP in Afghanistan. She was 26 when she became an MP, and now she's in exile, as are many of the other prominent women. But another strange thing happened. When the Taliban came back in, there'd been all this time that we had not been able to go up certain roads because there was fighting along those roads. And then suddenly there was no war. So in the first month, suddenly we could go to places that you couldn't go to before. And I had conversations with Talibs that I had never had before. I went to a particular place in Wardok and I met this family, and their house had been raided by the Americans and the Afghan National Army, looking for this particular son of the household. And we had this long conversation, and I followed him up the hill to where his brother, another Talib, had been buried. And he just forgot that we were there, and he just went down and counted his beads and mourned his brother. And I thought, oh my God, this is just like when I have been with the British, and I see that there's a little shrine at one of their bases for the British dead in Afghanistan. And I got that feeling of them being the same, but on opposite sides. And I'm just going to read a very, very short poem from the book, which I think speaks to this. So in this book, I relate journalism and reportage, what we do, to poetry, because poetry expresses what we can't express. And this poem called Uncertain Survivors by Gunther Kuhnert, and it's translated from the German by Michael Hamburger. When the man was dragged out from under the debris of his shelled house, he shook himself and said, "Never again. At least, not right away."
In fact, the book will have you with goosebumps at every page because it has poetry and prose, both very beautifully put together. Vishnu, the idea that you are just continuously covering, this war or that war, and it's somehow there's no end to it. That you'll be reporting, or you'll be anchoring a show about the India-Pakistan situation, for example, and it just sounds curiously like something 30 years ago. The idea that conflicts just don't seem to go away.
No, conflicts don't seem to go away, and I think as somebody who covers conflict, you need to ask yourself whether you want to do this indefinitely. There's a certain high that journalists get in covering conflict, let's face it. I think it is very much, as one of our panelists mentioned, to know about the extremities of human nature and of what human beings endure. But at some stage, I think it's time that one really sort of pulls oneself away to get an idea of, am I necessarily the right person to be doing this indefinitely? Because it is dangerous at so many levels. And very briefly, there were two instances which made me realize how close we were to, perhaps not making it back. I was, 24 years old. I was in Kargil. I was on one bank of the Suru River. There was an all India radio transmitter which was being struck, or the Pakistanis were attempting to strike it using 3-round volleys of artillery. They'd been missing for the last several days. It just so happened that I was standing there and it went up, it blew up in front of my eyes. So we got onto my car, and my cameraman was he was also my age, 24 at that stage. You tend to be quite stupid when you're younger. And sort of goading me on and saying, chalte, aage badhte, let's film this from a closer angle. Long story short, we got over there in the mistaken belief that there was no artillery shell which was going to come close to us because they were shelling the ridgeline. Surely they couldn't hit us. As it turned out, there was an artillery shell. And I'm here to talk because it didn't strike me. And the way it works is that you feel searing heat, right? It's just this wave of heat across your face, and then you hear the sound, and then you fall, and then you run, which is what we did. And then I told myself how stupid I was. But a month later, I was on a helicopter shortly after the Kargil war in the north of Gujarat, the day after the Indian Air Force had shot down a Pakistani reconnaissance aircraft, in which I think 16-odd Pakistani soldiers and airmen were killed. And somebody in the Pakistani army had fired a Stinger missile, or an RBS-70, which is a surface-to-air missile, as we were about 5 kilometers away from the international border. The helicopter went diving down because the pilot actually knew what had happened. He'd seen a flash. Again, just to summarize, you can either be very stupid in covering a conflict, or you can in fact be in a situation where, you can end up perishing. either way, when you cover conflict over a period of time, as I do, you know that if there is a quote-unquote bullet with your name on it, then you may not make it back. So you need to be wise about that.
The odds add up. Eventually, there's a cumulative odds situation. Christopher, you've written about, you say, I don't wear a flak jacket, so I don't go to the war front. But you are looking, and you spoke about the war in Gaza, for example. We're looking at that situation. We've been here before. We've been here when Gaza has been destroyed, when we're talking about the reconstruction of Gaza. We've been there when people have been killed, and now there are new generations growing up with this. When you look to the future, is there some hope?
There is always hope. Of course there is hope. Looking at this audience, looking at this panel, looking at the interest that is generated, the compassion that is generated, of course there is hope. I'm very interested by this idea of somehow someone being involved and yet detached from conflict. I'm married to an Iranian. I have 2 half-Iranian children. I spent 7 years living in Iran and many years subsequent to that coming and going from Iran and covering Iran. And there were moments in that time, particularly during moments of political crisis, when I felt extremely exposed and extremely conflicted. Because on the one hand, I had a responsibility and also a deep-seated desire to get the story out. On the other hand, I knew that I was skating close to thin ice. I remember at one stage, there was a political crisis. Every single foreign journalist was expelled. I and one other, who was also married to an Iranian, were the only ones who were permitted to remain. And this was a crisis that was over a disputed election. Everyone was starting to say that the British were behind it. There was a British hand. And as you can sense from my accent, I have that cross to bear. I attended
Are you going to apologize at this point?
I'm not going to apologize. I've said enough. I attended Friday prayers, which was the closest I came to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is known for his dislike of the British hand. And I was sitting where roughly the front row is, and he was sitting roughly at that distance. And during his sermon that day, he looked directly into my eyes and said, "And the worst of all are the British."
My God.
And I cannot tell you what happened to my blood when that happened. Anyway, I managed to skirt my way around those particular ambiguities. I think that the panel is really good at just bringing out that conflict between the desire that we have to get the story out and the responsibility that we have to people who are close to us, even if that is our fixer. My last point is that when you do go into a conflict, and it's very, very important that although you have local voices reporting on local issues, it's extremely important to have different eyes, because a different eye sees different things. At the moment, this is not being funded, this is being downgraded. The big news organizations are cutting their budgets for people to travel, and this goes hand in hand with a well-intentioned belief that it is local people who should report on local conflicts. That, to an extent, is true, but you also need the objectivity that comes, insofar as that is possible, from the outsider. So I want more Indians traveling to England to report on Brexit.
Right. Well, be careful what you wish for, is all I'd say. But I think this is an important point. You know, years ago, I did get involved in a bomb blast, and I had a boss who was consistently saying to me, "You don't make your deadlines, you don't make your deadlines. You know, what's the point of a story if you're not going to make air?" And when I came through, out of this, I was in a hospital recovering. I remember him on the phone saying, "What have I always told you? The only pretty picture is the one that makes air." And I think that's how we cope. That's how we live with it, because our job is not to get hit. Our job is to get the story to all of you and to bring that home. I'd like a round of applause for this great panel. But we do have time for some questions. So if you have questions, please make sure they're questions, no comments over here. We'll come rapid fire to you and try to get you some answers. Do you want to just go ahead? There's a gentleman who's sat down patiently, so he deserves the first question. Yeah, just give him the mic.
My quick question, is China-Tibet a done deal? Sorry, is a done deal or is still a frontier? There's so much little reportage on that.
Sure. Great question. Where is the mic? Can I see a show of hands? It's hard. There's a gentleman who's already standing up, so he's pretty sure he's going to ask a question. If we can get a mic out to him. And why are all the ladies in the audience not asking a question? Okay, I'm coming to you next.
I have hundreds of questions.
No, just one.
But I'll just. Why is it that we are not talking about the deep state of America, which is at the back of all the problems, and why we are looking away from it?
Okay, thank you. There's a lady over here. I'm sorry, I'm going to make you run a lot today. There's a lady right here. If you can just find the person with the mic who's coming through. Here, she's right here, yeah.
Hi, I wanted to follow up on when the news becomes personal, and this is directed to the moderator, the two Indian panelists, which is press freedom in India, and what do you do about that? India today ranks 159 out of 180 countries, near the bottom of press and media freedom. And so what do you do? So this is particularly about India, but you know, if you're covering China and you want to continue to have access to China and you're half Chinese, Edward Wong and others, how do you deal with this personal challenge of being true to your principles as a reporter in an environment where any critical media in India is being shut down? Thank you.
All right, another great question. I'm sorry, that's all that we have time for. I have 5 minutes to get you some answers. I'm going to go around the panel. And I also want each of you to, in that 1 minute that you've got, tell me if you've got a coping mechanism for everything you have just described to us, which has been very moving. Ghaith, do you want to start?
The deep state, I think Ed represents the deep state. I'm not joking, I'm just like, seriously. A coping mechanism is I draw and I cook, and I think these are the best coping mechanisms. And to have an amazing partner, that's another coping mechanism. But kind of, how do you I mean, this is a very good question. How do we live in this kind of balance between getting access to that country that we want to report from and writing the things we want to write about? And I think that is a question that all of us try to...
It is just a constant. Edward?
So two quick things, China and Tibet. Right now, I don't see any near future where Tibet will become truly autonomous or independent. The Chinese forms of control in Tibet are intense. It's a military security occupation of the area, and there's intense technological surveillance. A lot of the Tibetan cause has been represented by the Dalai Lama here in India, and a big question is what happens when the Dalai Lama passes away, which will happen soon, and will there be reincarnation?
We hope not too soon.
Yeah, not too soon, hopefully, yeah. And will there be a charismatic figure that will keep Tibet alive and the cause of Tibet alive in the consciousness of the world? The deep state of America, I would say that's the term that, people like President Trump have used to demonize the federal workforce of America. It's become a term that really has become meaningless, in my opinion, in terms of it's become contextless. But I think you're asking about what about the foreign policy establishment in America and its goals. I'm a firm believer that the general consensus goal of most people working foreign policy in America is to maintain American power and dominance across the world. And they do it in different ways. And it's impacted the lives of everyone in this room. And
you do need to read Edward's book to answer your question. Yaroslav, coping mechanisms.
Yeah, well, I just want to go back to the first question first. I think access is a huge issue in journalism now, because if we look at the world, we cannot go to Russia anymore. My colleague Evan was imprisoned in Russia and spent 1.5 years there behind bars for doing journalism. It's very hard to go to China. It's almost impossible to go to Iran. So there are entire areas, super important stories in the world that are just basically, terra incognita that you try to cover through social media from abroad, which is harder and harder. as a journalist. And now, as for coping, well, in addition to all the mechanisms that Ghaith has mentioned, great partner, cooking, writing. I think you know, the more you put words on paper, the easier it is to deal with it.
And getting it out. It seems like there's a huge shout out going to all the partners of all of these great journalists. I see one more over here. So really a round of applause for all of you. Christopher, do you want to take that?
On the coping mechanism, I think we're very lucky in our day and age in that at the end of the days, fighting begrimed and befuddled, wherever we end up, we usually have internet access, we usually have access to our families, we can talk, we can get away, we have that exit, which in the past, of course, correspondents didn't have. I was very impressed in Iraq. I came across a journalist who used to take himself fishing. And he would just get away from the fighting for a few days and go fishing, which I think is good. The traditional coping mechanism, of course, should never be underestimated. And that's about this high, it's glass, and it has a screw top.
We're not allowed to say anything further. We're discussing water, of course. Lindsey, go ahead.
My coping mechanism, obviously, is that I read poetry. Because journalism is of the moment, but poetry lasts forever.
Very beautifully put. Vishnu, there's a special question for India there. I'll answer it as well.
No, just in terms of China and Tibet, I sort of operate in that space as well. You can't get to these areas, so I use a lot of satellite imagery. It's transformed the face of journalism, including, in a sense, conflict journalism. On the issue of coping, if you are tough enough to be doing these stories, you should be tough enough to handle it. Easier said than done. I have full respect for those who need to get out of it, but in the context of Indian journalists covering conflict, we just get back into our studios or get back to the next story and just keep going. That's just the way it is. I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
All right.
And so I've ducked out of the other question because I need a session to answer that.
That's true. Ma'am, the only thing I'd say is the only way to keep your principles is to keep your principles. And when I speak to younger journalists, particularly who do ask that question, I always make the point, you have chosen to be a journalist. You could make a lot more money. You could get much better sleep. You could have better work times and access to facilities, even toilets. You could be safe in so many other jobs. Don't become a journalist unless you want to be true to that. Thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience, but this is the end of this session. So thank you, and thank you to all of you.